kind of a momentous day of sorts. My understanding next Sunday, Tom Denton and Bonnie, I think, are going to share their experience at this point. And then 2 weeks from today, Pastor Dale will be here and his family. They'll be here on Saturday. He will be preaching. At the end of that service, as a church, you will be casting ballots. You'll be making a decision. He's going to come and you're going to check him out. You understand that he's checking you out at the same time. Kind of goes both ways. To be very honest, this idea of a pastor and a church coming together and trying to figure out what's the right fit. Because we all understand that sometimes really good men show up at really good churches and it doesn't just work. So this idea, and I today have some things I want to share with you that I really started on about 5 years ago. In fact, in November of 2019, I told First Baptist Church in Effingham, I'm about ready to retire. We kind of discussed some options, and I said, I'll just keep preaching, and I'll keep pastoring, and you in January start looking for the next pastor. And so he eventually came, and they called him in August of 20, and he's been there since, and he's doing a phenomenal job. But I spent a lot of time really thinking about how do churches and pastors get together, and how do you get it to work out? And I came to the observation that one of the real challenges is expectations. Sometimes a pastor comes in and there's things he expects. And there's a church and they have expectations. And sometimes they don't go together. And so today I want to spend a little time talking about that in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 15. There's a fabulous little verse. And of all the images in the Bible for a pastor, it is the idea of a shepherd. In fact, pastor has the term pastoral or pasture. It's the idea of a shepherd and a sheep. And at one of the weakest and most difficult times in the life of Israel, a time when they are not being the people of God they ought to be. And God sends Jeremiah, and Jeremiah's returned, by the way, over and over and over in the book of Jeremiah. He says, return. God says, return. And it's pretty much to where Jeremiah says, all right, if you folks will just straighten up and fly right, if you just turn around and get where you need to be and be the people of God that you need to be, here's what God says I'll do. I will give you shepherds after my own heart, who will feed you with knowledge and understanding. Shepherds after my own heart, who will feed you with knowledge and understanding. To me, that's a great image, but it also suggests there's a two-sided deal when you start thinking about calling a pastor. And I'm not going to jump into very much. I try not to say much, but I've had some great conversations with David. We talked this last week for about an hour. We've talked previous to that. And I would also just say, although you have to make the decision as a church, you need to pray through this and be ready for 2 weeks, but it really does seem like there's a lot of circumstances that have fallen into place. And I observed the committee and the way they've been at work and the way things that happen, the nature of the committee itself, lots of things seem to have come together. But this idea of it's two-sided. God says, people of God, you behave. Pastor, you need to be after my own heart and be doing the things that I want you to do. And so I've come up with basically a sermon of 5 things that every church has a right to expect of their pastor. And 5 things that every pastor has a right to expect from their church. So we're going to go through them a little bit, and basically we may spend just a few minutes longer than normal because there's a lot of things to talk about. But first of all, we'll start with what the church has the right to expect. And some of this is based on being a pastor for 40 years, having grown up in a pastor's home, who pastored for 50 years, having 2 son-in-laws who are in ministry, and a brother who's an ordained pastor, and a sister who married a person in ministry, and having been around literally hundreds and hundreds of pastors. I just want to be straightforward and talk about something. So number 1, every church has the right to expect that their pastor will work. And by the way, work hard. That's an expectation. I will tell you, I've not really seen a lot of laziness in ministry. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, and it can exist, but the truth is, most pastors work. And the work that they do is different. It's not 9 to 5. It is literally a lifetime. Therefore, I want to say to you, you are not hiring a preacher. You need to be thinking about calling a man of God who is a pastor. I don't know about the number of hours that he'll work. If you call him, but I will tell you that I've worked a lot of hours over the years. I spent a lot of time, and it's on-call time, and I didn't get a lot of phone calls in the middle of the night, but they came. And I got a lot of texts and a lot of emails, a lot of phone calls, and there were lots of times, and days off were even kind of complicated, because doggone it, people just don't die conveniently. Sometimes they get sick, and you got to have major surgery, and you just have to do things, and I will just tell you, sometimes it is a long time. 50 hours was not an unusual thing. Vacation Bible School, Revival, 60 hours. There were lots of long hours, but that's all right. People who are in ministry understand that. Expect him to work. And expect him to work hard. But also understand that that work involves a lot of different things. And it's probably the biggest problem that I see with this fit business, that every single individual in the congregation has their own set of expectations about what that pastor ought to be doing. And you understand that's pretty complicated. And there are people who expect you ought to be doing this, and you ought to be doing this, and it ought to be done this way. And the real challenge with that is, where I finally came to peace in ministry, is that I understood. I had a personnel committee, I had expectations, I had a job description, and I understood all of that. And I wasn't ignoring that, but I finally found peace in ministry when I came to this conclusion that what God expected of me was more important than what anybody else in the church expected. And that if I could get to Saturday night, that's kind of the way I always thought about the week, if I'd start on Monday and I get through Saturday, and then church came, and then, by the way, it all started again. But if I could get to the end of the week and realize in ministry, there's never a time when you clock out. There's never a time. There was never a Saturday night. I did everything I needed to do. Could have prayed for another 30 minutes. Could have worked another hour on a sermon. There were some sermons I preached that needed more than an hour. There was a lot. Could have made 5 more visits. You could always do more, but in the end, on Saturday night, I had to say, Lord, I've done to the best of my ability what you wanted me to do. And if I could please God and meet his expectations, then the over-shepherd, the great shepherd, and I was the under-shepherd, then I've done what I needed to do. But expect him to work. And that work will look differently. I think even the years of ministry, there was a time when a pastor, and by the way, I'm glad that a new pastor is going to have that really nice office to sit in. But you understand, he doesn't need to be in that office 40 hours a week. Right? The conversation I had with Dale, the very first thing he needs to do when he gets here, if he comes, if you call him and the call is good and he decides to come, the very first 6 months, he's going to be making appointments in every one of your homes. He's going to come and sit in your house, so you have to clean it. Well, you don't have to, but he's going to come and he's going to visit in your home, and he's going to sit in your living room, or he's going to sit at your kitchen table, and he's going to ask you questions, and he's going to get to know you, and you're going to have a conversation. And he may not do that all the time, but he's going to do it at least once, so the next time there's a crisis or a problem, he's going to have been in your home once before. And he's going to know something about you when he's preaching, and he's working on sermons, and that's a part of it. And that was his plan. That's what he's going to be doing. That's part of his work. And understand, once he gets through some of that, it's going to be those people who used to come to the church and aren't going anyplace now. Then it's going to be people that are in the community and don't even know Christ. And there's going to be a lot of folks. The work of a pastor is people. I will tell you, the cell phone has changed ministry. In an hour, I can send 20 texts and 5 emails and call 7 people, and I can communicate with folks faster and more easier. And just the idea of sitting in an office waiting for somebody to come and talk to me is not the way you do ministry anymore. But you have the right to expect him to work. Secondly, you have the right to expect him to maintain his relationship with Christ. In fact, it's one of the things you need desperately to expect. It took me a long time to come to the conclusion that the scope of my ministry was never any greater than my own time of devotion and relationship with Jesus Christ. I mean, no sermon is better than my own relationship with Christ. No amount of ministry. And to be very honest, I would start out on Monday with and I used legal pads. I had those out on the desk, and I'd start out and I'd do my devotion time. I'd read some scripture, and I'd do a little bit of praying, and then I'd start to write down what I thought I needed to do for this next week. And I will tell you that if I didn't have the devotion time, I could still put down appointments, but they never turned out quite as well. It was amazing how, as I had my own relationship with Christ, all of a sudden, in my mind, there's a name of somebody that I hadn't seen for a long time, and I write their name down, and when I check on them about another few hours later, there was a perfect reason. There's a relationship. So in that nice office, sometimes the door needs to be closed. You need to expect him to spend time in the Word. You need to expect him to spend time praying. You need to expect him. And by the way, that probably will come out in the sermons. His relationship with God. Expect him to have that. And by the way, that's the reason for going to conferences sometimes. That's the reason for going to a retreat. That's the reason for occasionally getting away for the idea of I need to make sure his spirit is right for him to be a pastor. Expect him to maintain his family. There's an awful lot in the scriptures about requirements for a pastor, and many of them are about him being a man of God in his home. I would tell you, pastors I know who were great preachers, great at everything, but didn't maintain their marriage, or didn't spend time with their children, didn't spend time doing the things they needed to do in family, and literally sacrificed their ministry. I don't know how I got the courage, but I was going to Effingham when I was only 32 years old, and we were just talking. I said, by the way, I want you to know I've got little children. I've got daughters. And I believe that before God created the church, he created the family. And I just want you to know, if there's something at school, I'm going to go and be with my kids. And for me, it was Saturday morning. We watched cartoons. That was really in-depth spiritual stuff. But I'd get up Saturday morning, and I'd watch cartoons with the girls and expect him to maintain his family. In fact, I even gave some individuals in the church that I would pray with at different times the permission and actually the request to occasionally, on their own, just approach me and say, Pastor, you take care of your wife lately? Are you doing a good job with your wife? By the way, there were a couple of those who actually would then occasionally slip me a little money to go on a date. It was $20. You couldn't do much with $20 today, but back then that was a lot of money. And hey, once you... There were people who would say it, you're spending time with your kids. I would tell you, you need to expect that, and you need to encourage that. And occasionally, he needs to not be in the office. Occasionally, he needs to be in his home. That's just the way it ought to be. And you ought to expect him to maintain his family. And doggone it, I don't know if he'll take care of his parents or not, but you ought to expect him to at least think about that. But you understand, you need to expect him to be a man of his family, maintain his family. Number four, you need to expect him to have something to say. I mean, when he stands up on Sunday morning, when he's teaching a Bible study, when he's doing something, he needs to have something to say, and he needs to have studied, and he needs to have said it well. He needs to have worked hard to figure out what to say. There's just something about that, and understand that's also something that you got to do in the office. And you got that night office, but he's got to do some research. He's got to study, and he needs to have something to say. And it's amazing how those things kind of all work together. And Garen's father became a Christian pretty late in life. I think in his 50s, early 50s. Anyway, he became a Christian late, and he'd never really gone much to church. And he started now attending a little Baptist church not far from the farm where he'd lived his entire life. And so we'd suddenly talk, and I'd say, well, how was Sunday school? He'd talk about that. And then one particular time I just said to him, so how was your pastor's sermon? And he thought for a second, and he said, well, my pastor didn't do much homework this week. Man, that scared the heck out of me. I want to tell you, I went home, worked harder on the next sermon. I put in hours I hadn't put in a long time. Expect him to have something to say. Now, not everybody says it the same way. And he will have his style, whoever you call. And if it's Dale, he'll have his style. But the way he says it is not as important as what he said. You remember that term? I will give you shepherds after my own heart, relationship with God, and who will feed you with knowledge and understanding. So that also means in that office, he needs to be working on that sermon, and he needs to have something to say. And number 5, you need to love him. You expect him to love you. I mean, you expect him. That's what shepherds do, and there's a distinction. Jesus made this. He talked about, and he used all kinds of shepherd analogies, but he said there's a difference between a shepherd and a hireling. A hireling does it for the money. That's why you're not just hiring a preacher. You're calling a shepherd. And a shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. A shepherd who loves it. So you need to expect any pastor to love you. And to that extent, he does get to know you. That's why he needs to come and find out who you are and learn about what's going on in your life. And at the same time, let me tell you, I think Dale really does want to come here. Now, we're talking about somebody wanting to come to Illinois. Wanting to come to Pinckneyville. Wanting to come to First Baptist Church in Pinckneyville. He feels that draw and he wants to love you. Well, let me just tell you that there's also a sense where if he's going to love you, you need to go out of being lovable. I mean, you need to go out of your way to be as lovable as you can. And I don't know how to tell it. I was with a group of pastors, and we were talking about the shortage of pastors. In fact, 23 resumes. Do you realize that 15 years ago you'd have had 123? There's a shortage of ministry, and part of it people are leaving ministry, and part of it's the stress, and part of it's the difficulty. Well, we got talking to a couple of guys, and he said, yeah, every Monday morning for the last 3 years, I have a lady who calls on Monday morning to complain about something from Sunday. Temperature wasn't right, sermon was too long, the illustration wasn't good, wasn't enough toilet paper in the ladies' restroom on the second floor. I mean, every single Monday she would call, and I got to that point where I didn't have that kind of thing, but I had some folks who, they weren't happy in their own life, and consequently they weren't happy at church a little bit, and we had caller ID in the church office. And so the phone would ring. I could see who it was. And every time, God gave me the grace, pick up the phone, and be as gracious as I could, and listen as well as I could, and do my best to love them. Let me tell you, some people are easier to love in the church than others. Expect him to love you, but to some extent, be loved. Well, those are 5 things that you have a right to expect from your pastor. And frankly, there's a lot of expectations, things that he needs to do. Work, maintain his relationship, maintain his family, something to say, love them. So now here's some things that a pastor ought to expect from his church. Number 1, the pastor has the right to expect you to pay him. It's a biblical principle. Priests in the Old Testament made their living by sharing a portion of the sacrifices. Prophets lived by ministry and the blessing of those who they prophesied to. Jesus and his disciples survived. One thing, there were wealthy women who provided and gave money to help survive and help them to do things. Paul talks about the workman is worthy of his hire. I'm not excited about the analogy, the muzzle not the ox that treads the corn. In other words, it's right for the people of God to pay a pastor. Now, you're going to get in your packet a budget and a proposal for a salary. And some of you are going to look at it and say, oh my goodness, we're going to pay that much? Well, it looks like a big number, but I want to remind you that out of that number, he has to provide health insurance for his family. That's not a benefit. He's got to come out of that number. Your last pastor paid $2,000 a month for his health insurance. $24,000 a year. So whatever that number is, subtract $24,000. Then he's got to have some kind of retirement, because you don't want a 97-year-old pastor. Eventually, he wanted to retire and get going. So he's got to provide retirement out of that money. Then he's got to provide other kinds of insurance for his family, for his house, for probably some life insurance to protect his wife. And then he's got to pay Social Security. Pastors are self-employed. They pay 15.3% Social Security. They pay the whole amount. It all comes out of that number. And so you start subtracting what he really has to live on is not a great deal. Now, based on your finances, as far as what comes in every week, it's a little bit of a stretch. But y'all got $1.3 million in the bank. A gift by somebody who loved their church. And at this point, you may vote no for some reason. But shame on you if you vote no because you think he's getting paid too much. That's not the reason. The money is going to be fine. It's not outrageous. It's not unreasonable. But you're talking about a person picking his family up and moving here. The money's reasonable. And he expects you to pay him, and you ought to pay him. And frankly, people saved by grace ought not to be cheap about anything. So, he has a right to expect you to pay him. Number two, he has a right to expect you to follow him. You do understand this analogy that's God, a shepherd, and sheep. I don't know how, most sheep are kind of dumb, to be real honest. I mean, if they don't got a shepherd to follow, they don't function very well. That's the analogy, that he's coming to be the shepherd. And you need to begin to be the sheep. Now, I know that there are a few of you that are substantially opinionated. Some of you are downright mule-headed. I understand. And you got an opinion on everything. And one of the challenges of being a minister, no matter what you do, everybody's got an opinion. But I want to say and suggest to you that if you call a new pastor, follow him. Now, he's spending time with the Lord. He's required by God to have a heart after God. So hopefully the things that he's going to suggest and encourage and the directions that he's going to lead are somehow connected to the heart of God. Now, over the years, I was back in Effingham the other day, 32 years ago. I want to tell you, I had some great ideas. I mean, I had some, I suggested, and of course the church voted, but we really ought to try this, or this might be a way to reach some people, or we ought to try this. And some of them, they were just flat out, why didn't we do this 5 years ago? Then there were some other ideas that, to be honest, just didn't work out so well. We tried some things, and the church gave me some grace, and they said, okay, and I know some of them in the back of their mind are saying, well, that's not going to work. We've never done it that way before. And some of them worked. Some of them didn't. And you know what? When they didn't work, the world didn't come to an end. We just said, all right, that didn't work. Let's try something different. Let's figure out a new way to do it. And it really wasn't a big deal. And so let me just say, I don't know that he's going to make a lot of changes. I don't know what God's going to put in his heart if he comes. But if God puts something in his heart, try it. Follow it. Give him some grace. And it may work. If it doesn't, that's okay. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't use your intelligence and wisdom and all that sort of thing, but follow him. He has the right to expect it if he's coming to be your shepherd. Number three, love his family. His kids, his wife. My 3 daughters, when they went away to college, had never been in any other church other than the one that I pastored. And I asked them various times, so what's it like going to another church? And their general conclusion is, well, it's okay, but we're not special there. They'd spent their whole life being special in church. That's the way it ought to be. Love his children. Love his family. Love his wife. And by that I mean let her be who she wants to be and who God wants her to be. And don't make expectations on her. You're not calling Rebecca. You're calling Dale, if that's indeed what you do. Rebecca just needs to be the person, the woman that God wants her to be. And then let me just go on to say that what I This week I talked to Dale, and this is just one of those weird little things. So Dale said, so I heard you were at Richland, Missouri a couple of weeks ago. That's the church I went to and I pastored. And he said, that's where Rebecca's parents grew up and met. In Richland, Missouri, a little town of 2,000 people. They were members of that church, and they got married and moved away from Richland before I got there. But Rebecca's grandparents were members of the church that I pastored. Ben and Rosie Scott. Rosie, she spoiled our daughters like crazy. She worked in child care. I mean, our kids were rotten on Mondays because they got spoiled at church, and Rosie was part of that. But she had one of the most gracious spirits, just delightful. And Ben was a deacon. But he was the kind of quiet deacon, never said anything. We had about 15, 18 deacons. But when Ben finally said something, everybody in the room got quiet. That's her grandparents on one side. On the other side, Roy Salzman was her grandfather. And Roy, man, I went fishing with Roy, and he just had one of the driest sense of humor. And I want to tell you, she's got some good family to come from. But love the family. Go out of your way. Spoil those kids. They'll get over it. It'll be all right. And make them understand that any church they go in the rest of their life, this was the best one. Love his family, and he has the right to expect you to do that. He has the right to expect you to talk to him. I used to say, don't talk about him, but I've given up on that because people are going to talk about their preacher. That's just the way it is. It's the nature of standing up in front of you, and people talk about the sermon, they talk about the pastor's wife, they do that. You're going to do it, and I want to encourage you to be gracious when you do. But I also want you to talk to him in two levels. One, if there's things going on in your life, let him know. Don't be upset when he didn't come and visit you in the hospital if he didn't know that you were in the hospital. Tell him what's going on. If there's burdens, if there are problems, let him know so he can be your pastor. He can be your shepherd. And then to be honest, if there's problems, talk to him. If there's something that you're struggling with or something that you're concerned about, talk to him personally. Don't spend all the time talking to 19 other people. And I always hated when somebody would come and say, well, Pastor, there's a lot of people upset about this. Well, sometimes it was just them. Maybe them and one or two others, but sit down and talk with them. And now, in Richland, Missouri, I was just 27, and I did some things. Didn't get it all right. But I had a couple of men who would come and talk to me. I didn't like what they had to say. But they obviously so cared about me that it wasn't their thing. It wasn't just they were upset. And you know, a lot of people get upset about stuff in the church, and it's one thing that only affects them. And the pastor has to think about the whole church and everybody. Those men came, and with such love in their heart, they just shared an issue. And then we prayed together. And it was obvious they were right, and I found the grace to change and grow and move beyond. But it wasn't because they came angry. It wasn't because they came mad. It's because they came and they loved me, and they only wanted what was best for the church. Sometimes you need to talk to them. And then finally, every pastor has the right to expect you to pray for him. The interim pastor, before I came to Effingham, Illinois, asked of the congregation, will you make an open commitment? I think he made him come down to the front. You will agree to pray for your pastor every week. There are people who do that. And then he went on and said, and if you're willing to pray for your pastor in your church every day, there were about 25 people who made a commitment to pray for me every day. In fact, when I retired, I spiritually missed the fact that they were now praying for somebody else. And I wondered over the years that I sometimes on Sunday mornings found the right word to say, not because I had it together, but because God was answering the prayers of the people of the church. And how many times on Monday morning when I was putting names down on the notepad that God put in my mind a name that I needed to go talk to because of the prayers of people in the church. And even to the point of times when there might have been temptation or discouragement or something else, that because there were people praying, God intervened and protected. Well, you are in a couple of weeks going to make a decision. And obviously prayer is probably the place that you begin. There's something good about trusting the committee who has been intensely into this, but you need to be praying. You need to come a couple of weeks praying. You need to read the materials and pray. I'll give you this final illustration. I think I shared a little bit about Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon, when he was a fairly young man, went to New Park Street Mission Church. It was a small church, wasn't huge, but it was a small church. Within a matter of months, they outgrew their building. He was a powerful preacher. And God just began to bless, and they moved finally into a big arena, kind of a big hall. And while they were there, they started building what became the Greater London Metropolitan Tabernacle. It was a building that would seat 3,000 people. And when they finally moved into it, if you wanted a seat in the auditorium on Sunday morning, you had to get there an hour and a half early. If you didn't get in, then they had windows, and the windows were all open. And there would be another 1,000 or so standing outside the windows without any microphone, anything like that. But they would stand out there. During his ministry, something like 18,000 people made professions of faith and were baptized. Now, to put that in perspective, I've pastored for about 40 years. My number's about 450, maybe 500. That's phenomenal. So toward the end of his ministry, he was asked, so what was the secret of your success? Here's what he said. When I went to Park Street Mission Church, they were already a praying church. Everything that has happened since I have been there, I attribute to the prayers of the people of God in that church. They had these phenomenal numbers on Sunday mornings. During the week, they had a prayer meeting. No Bible study, no sermon, no music. They just, over 1,000 people would typically show up to pray. When they built the tabernacle, underneath the pulpit, there was a room. And he never went to the pulpit that there were not people kneeling in the room directly under it, praying for what was going to happen. Well, we're going to pray about the next couple of weeks. I will tell you, I think God has a plan. God has a plan for the people of God to be who they ought to be. He has a plan and expectations for pastors to be who they ought to be. And I'll be up front with you, there are pastors who mess it up. Sometimes there's churches who mess it up, but I want to tell you, the people of God get it right. And a man of God gets it right. And they come together, good things can happen. And I'm praying that good things will happen. I hope you're praying about those good things as well. And the expectations, well, let me just say, on both sides, there ought to be a lot of grace, and a lot of love, and a lot of understanding, and a lot of mercy. And God can work those things out.